Sarah Thompson's hands trembled as she parallel parked her weathered Honda Civic outside the Richardson County Courthouse. The morning sun glinted off the building's imposing marble columns, casting long shadows across the steps where a handful of people in suits hurried past. She checked her watch. 8:47 a.m. 13 minutes to spare, though her racing heart made it feel like she was already late. The events of last Tuesday played through her mind like a broken record. Maya's wheezing had grown worse during school, and the nurse's call came just as Sarah was finishing her shift at Memorial Hospital. Her daughter's lips had started turning blue. In those terrifying moments racing to the school, speed limits were the last thing on her mind. The flash of the traffic camera in the school zone had barely registered. Now, checking her reflection in the rearview mirror, Sarah smoothed her pressed navy blazer, the one she saved for important meetings, and gathered the stack of documents on the passenger seat. Emergency room records, Maya's updated asthma action plan, her spotless 15-year driving record. Surely Judge Harrison would understand that a mother's split-second decision during a medical emergency deserved leniency. As she climbed the courthouse steps, Sarah overheard fragments of conversation from two lawyers walking ahead of her. "Harrison's in a good mood today," one said. "Just gave Thompson a slap on the wrist for doing 45 in that school zone on Oak Street." Sarah's steps faltered. That was exactly her violation on exactly the same street. The fourth-floor courtroom was already half full when she slipped inside. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, and the morning light filtered through tall windows, creating an atmosphere that should have felt dignified but instead felt oppressive. Sarah chose a seat in the third row, directly behind a well-dressed white man who was completing his hearing. "Given your clean record, Mr. James Thompson, I'm reducing the fine to $200, Judge Harrison announced, his tone almost paternal. "Drive more carefully next time, son." The man nodded gratefully and walked past Sarah, their shared surname an ironic detail that didn't escape her notice. Sarah used the following minutes to observe Judge Harrison. He was in his early 60s, with steel gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that he frequently adjusted. His interaction with the next few defendants seemed professional, even friendly at times. She began to relax slightly. The emergency room records would surely carry weight with someone who appeared to be reasonable. Sarah Louise Thompson. The change was subtle but immediate. Judge Harrison's smile vanished as she approached the podium, replaced by something harder. His eyes flicked over her professional attire and well-organized documents with what looked like skepticism. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice cleared despite her nerves. "I'm here regarding a speed violation in a school zone, but there were extenuating circumstances. My daughter." "Ms. Thompson," he cut her off, emphasizing her marital status in a way he hadn't done with previous defendants. "The posted speed limit is not a suggestion. It exists to protect children. Are you stating that you believe some children's safety is more important than others?" The question landed like a slap. In the gallery, a few heads turned. The young court reporter's fingers hesitated over her stenograph, and the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Sarah felt a familiar weight settle in her stomach, the leaden feeling of facing a battle she hadn't chosen but couldn't avoid. Little did she know, this moment would spark a chain of events that would expose decades of judicial bias and change the Richardson County court system forever. The courtroom's silence grew heavier as Sarah drew out her daughter's emergency room records with steady hands, steadier than she felt inside. "Your Honor, my daughter was having a severe asthma attack. Her oxygen levels were—" "Ms. Thompson," Judge Harrison interrupted again, his voice carrying a sharp edge that hadn't been present during previous cases. "Are you suggesting that breaking the law becomes acceptable when it's inconvenient to follow it?" He peered down at her over his wire-rimmed glasses, his fingers drumming against his mahogany bench. In the third row, Elena Martinez, the young court reporter, glanced between her stenograph and the scene unfolding before her. In 3 years of recording proceedings, she'd never seen Judge Harrison dismiss medical documentation without at least reviewing it. Her fingers hovered over the keys, capturing every word while her mind raced, calculating the statistical improbability of what she was witnessing. "No, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice firm despite the growing knot in her throat. "I'm providing context for an emergency situation where—" "Context." Harrison's voice boomed across the courtroom. Several people in the gallery flinched. "The context, Ms. Thompson, is that you were caught driving 45 miles per hour in a 20-mile-per-hour school zone. The same violation as Mr. Thompson before you, yet I sense considerably less remorse." The irony of the shared surname hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's grip tightened on the podium. Your Honor, with all due respect, I've brought documentation. $800, Harrison declared, cutting through her words like a knife. Due in full within 30 days. He raised his gavel. Your Honor, please. Sarah's professional composure cracked slightly. I'm a single mother. Could I arrange a payment plan? The same arrangement he'd granted to 3 previous defendants that morning. Harrison's expression hardened further. Ms. Thompson, this court's time is valuable. The fine stands due in full. Next case. In the back of the courtroom, Gerald Watson, a retired civil rights attorney, furiously scribbled in his leather-bound notebook. He'd been monitoring Harrison's courtroom for weeks, gathering data for a friend at the ACLU. Today's proceedings were the most blatant display yet. Alina's fingers trembled slightly as she typed the final exchange. The disparity was stark. $200 fine with a payment plan for James Thompson. $800 due immediately for Sarah Thompson. Same offense, same clean record, different treatment. Her stomach churned as she recorded the proceedings, knowing these transcripts would eventually tell their own story. As Sarah gathered her documents, a subtle movement caught her eye. The bailiff, Officer Marcus Chen, gave her an almost imperceptible nod toward the court clerk's office. 20 years on the job had taught him to recognize injustice, even when it wore a black robe. Walking out of the courtroom, Sarah's mind spun with calculations. $800 meant choosing between Maya's asthma medication and a fine. Between after-school care and potential jail time for non-payment. Between silence and speaking up. Behind her, Elena slipped a yellow sticky note into the day's transcript, marking it for future reference. Gerald Watson pulled out his phone, typing a quick message to his ACLU contact. Officer Chen adjusted his stance, remembering similar scenes he'd witnessed over the years. They were all witnesses now, their silence a weight heavier than the fine itself. But silence, like most things in that courtroom, was about to be judged in an entirely new way. The kitchen table had become a battlefield of papers, bills spread out like casualties of war. Sarah stared at the numbers until they blurred, her untouched cup of coffee growing cold beside her. Maya's asthma medication, $235. After-school care for both kids, $400. The court fine, $800. Her next paycheck wouldn't cover even half of it. Mommy? Maya's voice cut through her calculations. Sarah quickly wiped her eyes, but her 10-year-old was too perceptive to fool. Are you crying because of the judge? Sarah forced a smile, pulling her daughter close. Maya's breathing was still slightly labored from her recent attack, a whistle in her chest that made Sarah's decision in the school zone feel right all over again. Just grown-up stuff, baby. Nothing for you to worry about. From the living room came the sound of her 7-year-old son, Marcus, playing with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, who watched the kids after school. The arrangement was a godsend. Mrs. Jenkins charged far less than formal childcare, understanding Sarah's situation as a single mother. But even her reduced rate was becoming a stretch. Your inhaler is making that funny noise again, Sarah noticed, giving the device a shake. 3 doses left. Her stomach clenched. The phone rang, displaying Memorial Hospital's number. Sarah answered, expecting it to be about her next shift in the administrative department. Instead, it was HR. Mrs. Thompson, we've received some concerning information about a court appearance. Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. Someone had talked. In a small town like theirs, courthouse gossip traveled fast. It was a traffic violation, she explained, keeping her voice steady. During my daughter's medical emergency. We need to schedule a meeting to discuss this. The HR representative's tone was clipped. The hospital has certain expectations about employee conduct. After hanging up, Sarah slumped in her chair. The fine wasn't just about money anymore. Her very livelihood was at stake. The irony wasn't lost on her. Rushing to save her daughter during a medical emergency might cost her the job at the very hospital that had treated Maya. Mrs. Jenkins appeared in the doorway, her kind face creased with concern. Those children are fed and homework's done, she announced, then hesitated. Sarah, I couldn't help overhearing. I remember when my Harold was alive, he always said the legal aid office helped folks who were treated unfairly. Sarah looked up sharply. I can't afford a lawyer. Legal aid is free, child. And that fine. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. I may be old, but I know wrong when I see it. My cousin got the same ticket last month. Hers was $200. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Another disparity. Another piece of evidence. Later that night, after tucking the kids in, Sarah sat on her bed and opened her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing, Richardson County Legal Aid Office. The search results loaded, revealing a phone number and a tagline. Justice shouldn't depend on your ability to pay for it. Her thumb brushed over the business card Officer Chen had slipped her on the way out of court. On the back, he'd written a name, Marcus Rodriguez, followed by, he handles the tough cases. Sarah glanced at the framed photo on her nightstand, her children's smiling faces at last year's school picnic. She thought about Maya's wheeze, the dwindling inhaler, the HR meeting, and Judge Harrison's dismissive glare. The weight of it all pressed down on her, but something else was rising too, determination. Tomorrow, she decided she would make the call, not just for herself, but for every parent who'd stood in that courtroom, feeling small but knowing they deserved better. The legal aid office wasn't what Sarah expected. Instead of the sterile government building she'd imagined, it occupied an old Victorian house, its paint peeling, but its garden meticulously maintained. A hand-painted sign read, Justice grows here, amid blooming marigolds. Sarah checked her watch, 12:30 p.m. Her lunch break from the hospital had just started, assuming she still had a job after tomorrow's HR meeting. She clutched her folder of documents, including 3 more cases of similar finds she discovered through Mrs. Jenkins' church group. Sarah Thompson? A voice called from the porch. Marcus Rodriguez didn't match his office's quaint exterior. He wore a crisp charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, but his warm smile and the scuffed briefcase he carried spoke of someone who hadn't forgotten his roots. Officer Chen said he might be coming by, Marcus said, leading her into what had once been a living room. Case files now lined the walls, and a worn leather couch faced a desk that had clearly witnessed countless difficult conversations. He's got good instincts about these things. Sarah settled into the couch, noting the framed newspaper article behind Marcus's desk. Local legal aid attorney wins landmark discrimination case. The date was just 3 months ago. Before we start, Marcus said, sitting not behind his desk, but in an adjacent armchair. Let me tell you about my mother. He pulled out an old photograph. Maria Rodriguez, 1992. She stood in front of Judge Harrison's predecessor, Judge Miller, for a parking violation. $500 fine, while the white defendant before her got a warning for the same offense. Sarah's eyes widened. What happened? She couldn't pay. Spent 3 days in jail. Marcus's casual tone belied the intensity in his eyes. I was 10. Watched my father scrape together bail money from our rent. That's when I decided to become a lawyer. He leaned forward, placing the photo on the coffee table between them. Now, tell me everything about your day in court. Every detail matters. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah recounted her experience. Marcus took notes, occasionally asking sharp, specific questions about Harrison's tone, exact wording, and the reactions of court staff. Here's what you need to know, Marcus said finally, pulling out his laptop. I've been building a case against Harrison for months. Your situation isn't isolated. He turned the screen toward her, revealing a spreadsheet of case data. Over the past year, his fines for minorities averaged 300% higher than those for white defendants. But proving bias requires more than statistics. Sarah pointed to her folder. I have these other cases. Better. Marcus grinned. But what we really need is internal court documentation. Patterns in his written opinions, communications, staff complaints. The court reporter, Sarah interrupted, remembering Alina's hesitation during the hearing. She seemed troubled by what happened. Marcus's eyes lit up. Alina Martinez. She's been documenting discrepancies in her personal notes for months, but she's afraid of losing her job. He paused, studying Sarah. This won't be easy. Harrison has powerful friends. The hospital's HR meeting. That's just the beginning of the pressure they'll try to put on you. Sarah thought of Maya's wheezing, of Mrs. Jenkins' quiet support, of Officer Chen's subtle act of resistance. I'm not looking for easy, she replied. I'm looking for right. Marcus nodded, reaching for his phone. Then let's get to work. I know a data analyst who can help us compile the evidence. But Sarah, his expression grew serious. From this moment on, document everything. Every call, every meeting, every subtle threat. We're not just fighting a bad decision anymore, we're challenging a broken system. Through the window, Sarah could see the marigolds swaying in the afternoon breeze. Justice grows here, the sign had said. She was about to test that promise. Lisa Chen's apartment looked more like a tech startup than a home. 3 monitors displayed cascading data, while sticky notes covered an entire wall in a complex pattern that only she seemed to understand. The data analyst's fingers flew across her keyboard as she input another set of court records. "Look at this pattern," Lisa said, gesturing to a graph. Sarah and Marcus leaned forward, squinting at the visualization. Judge Harrison's fines don't just show racial disparity. They show escalation. The gaps between sentences have been widening over the past 5 years. Marcus whistled softly. "Can you break it down by gender?" "Already did." Lisa pulled up another screen. Black women receive the harshest penalties, averaging 400% higher than white men for identical offenses. Sarah's case isn't an outlier, it's the culmination of a trend. Sarah's phone buzzed. Another message from HR. The discussion had turned into a formal review. 3 of her coworkers had stopped speaking to her entirely. But none of that mattered as much as what she was seeing on these screens. "There's more," Lisa said, lowering her voice. "Someone inside the courthouse has been trying to contact me. They've been documenting things independently." Marcus straightened. "Elena?" "No," Lisa shook her head. "Someone higher up. They sent me this encrypted file last night." She opened a document that made both Sarah and Marcus catch their breath. Internal memos, private comments, calendar entries, a digital paper trail of bias spanning years. "Judge Harrison's former clerk," Lisa explained. "She's been collecting evidence since 2019. Was too scared to come forward alone, but when she heard about our investigation." A knock at the door made them all jump. Lisa quickly minimized her screens, but it was only Officer Chen, still in his courthouse uniform. "Thought you should know," he said, closing the door behind him. "Harrison's asking questions." His clerk was going through old case files today, pulling anything involving racial demographics. "He's covering his tracks," Marcus muttered. "Not anymore." Chen pulled out his phone, showing them photos of document pages. "I caught these before they could be misplaced. Backdated fine adjustments, deleted demographic data." Sarah's hand trembled as she examined the photos. "He's been doing this for years. How many families has he hurt? How many people couldn't pay their rent or buy medicine or—" "Hey," Marcus touched her shoulder. "That's why we're here. That's why this matters." Lisa turned back to her computers. "With this new evidence, I can prove statistical significance in the bias pattern. Chen's photos provide context for the data gaps I've been seeing, and the insider's documents." She trailed off, her expression growing concerned. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "Your hospital review tomorrow? It's not random. Look at this email chain." Lisa pointed to a message thread. "Harrison's brother sits on the hospital board. The pressure on your job, it's coming from him." Sarah felt the floor tilt slightly. Maya's inhaler was almost empty. The fine deadline was approaching, and now her job, her ability to care for her children, hung by a thread. "We can back off," Marcus said quietly. "File a simple appeal for your case. Try to reduce the fine. No one would blame you." Sarah looked at the data flowing across Lisa's screens. Each number represented a person, a family, a story like hers. She thought of her daughter asking why she was crying, of Mrs. Jenkins' quiet strength, of Elena's trembling fingers on the stenograph. "No," she said firmly. "They're counting on our fear, on our silence." She squared her shoulders. "What's our next step?" Lisa smiled, turning back to her keyboards. "We follow the digital breadcrumbs, and we make them count." In the courthouse across town, unaware of the net closing around him, Judge Harrison signed another disproportionate fine, adding one more data point to his own downfall. The Richardson County Gazette headline hit like a thunderbolt. PTTRN of PREJUBIC. Local judge accused of systematic racial bias. Sarah's hands shook as she read the morning paper in her kitchen, her phone already buzzing with notifications. "Mom?" Marcus Jr. called from the living room. "You're on TV." Indeed, the local news was running a segment showing Sarah leaving the courthouse, spliced with statistics from their investigation. The reporter's voice was clear and damning. Sources indicate Judge Harrison's fines for minorities averaged 4 times higher than those for white defendants, with single mothers facing the harshest penalties. Her phone rang. Marcus Rodriguez. "Turn on Channel 7, he said without preamble. "Harrison's supporters are about to make their move." Sure enough, County Commissioner Baldwin, Judge Harrison's longtime golf partner, was at a podium. "These accusations are a calculated attack on our justice system," he declared, his face red with practiced indignation. Mrs. Thompson's traffic violation endangered children. Now she's trying to play the race card to avoid responsibility. Sarah's heart sank as they showed her hospital ID photo, clearly taken from her personnel file. The message was clear. They were coming for her job. Her phone chimed with a text from Lisa. Check your email. Now. The email contained a link to a Facebook group, Victims of Judge Harrison. In 12 hours since the story broke, it had gained over 3,000 members. Stories poured in, each one eerily similar to Sarah's. Single mothers, minority defendants, all hit with excessive fines, all struggling with the aftermath. Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Jenkins appeared at her back door, newspaper in hand. The church ladies want to help. We've been taking up a collection. I can't accept that, Sarah interrupted gently. It's not for the fine, Mrs. Jenkins said firmly. It's for the legal fund. To help Marcus fight this all the way up. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Elena Martinez. Meeting in 20 minutes. Parking garage, level 3. Important. The hospital parking garage was quiet at mid-morning. Elena paced between two columns, still in her court reporter's outfit. They're shredding documents, she blurted as Sarah approached. Judge Harrison came in early before hours. I saw them feeding files into the shredder. Did you? I got pictures. Elena's voice shook. And something else. Harrison's clerk, she's willing to talk, but she needs guarantees. Protection. Sarah called Marcus immediately. Within an hour, they were in Lisa's apartment turned command center, watching social media explode. #Judge Harrison must go was trending locally. National civil rights organizations were picking up the story. They'll try to discredit you, Marcus warned, watching the feeds. Make it personal. Ugly. As if on cue, Sarah's phone lit up with a new email from the hospital board. Immediate suspension pending investigation into professional conduct. But something unexpected was happening. Hospital staff were pushing back. The nurses' union released a statement supporting her. 3 doctors went on record about Harrison's history of biased rulings affecting their patients' ability to afford care. Mom? Maya stood in the doorway of Lisa's apartment, just dropped off by Mrs. Jenkins. Are we in trouble? Sarah pulled her daughter close, breathing in the faint wheeze that started this all. No, baby. We're making trouble. Sometimes that's what justice looks like. Her phone chimed one last time. A message from an unknown number. Judge Harrison requests a private meeting. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Marcus read the message over her shoulder. It's a trap. No, Sarah said, watching the social media feed scroll, seeing the faces and stories of others like her multiply. It's an opportunity. He thinks he's calling me in to offer a deal. But, Sarah smiled grimly, but I'm done being silent, and I'm not going alone. Outside, news vans were already gathering at the courthouse steps, waiting for tomorrow's next chapter. The courthouse hallway stretched before Sarah like a gauntlet. At her side, Marcus Rodriguez carried a slim briefcase containing what Lisa had dubbed their nuclear auction. Complete digital records of Harrison's discriminatory patterns, including the whistleblower testimonies. You don't have to do this, Marcus reminded her softly. Actually, I do. Sarah squared her shoulders, thinking of the hundreds of messages she received overnight. Women who'd lost jobs because they couldn't pay Harrison's excessive fines. Families who'd gone into debt. Lives derailed by his prejudice. Judge Harrison's chambers were exactly what you'd expect. Dark wood, leather-bound books, the trappings of authority. The judge himself sat behind his massive desk, flanked by Commissioner Baldwin and a man Sarah recognized as James Mitchell, the hospital board president. Mrs. Thompson. Harrison's tone was carefully neutral. I appreciate you coming in to discuss this unfortunate situation. Ms. Thompson, Sarah corrected quietly, noting how his jaw tightened at the defiance. Mitchell leaned forward. Sarah, we all want to resolve this reasonably. Your job at the hospital, your children's situation. These things don't need to be complicated by unnecessary accusations. Unnecessary. A new voice joined the conversation. Elena Martinez stood in the doorway, holding a thick folder. Behind her, Officer Chen positioned himself casually by the door. Harrison's face darkened. This is a private meeting. Not anymore. Marcus opened his briefcase. Not when we have evidence of systematic discrimination affecting hundreds of families across this county. Evidence? Baldwin scoffed. A few statistical anomalies. 412 cases, Lisa Chen announced, entering with her laptop. Over 5 years. Average fine disparity of 312% between white and minority defendants. Gender bias factor of 27% additional penalty for women of color. And that's just what we found in the public records. Harrison stood, his facade cracking. This is absurd. You can't possibly. Judge Harrison? A quiet voice came from his private office door. Amanda Wells, his clerk of 15 years, stepped into view. I'm sorry, but I can't stay silent anymore. The color drained from Harrison's face. Amanda. She placed a USB drive on his desk. Every email, every private note, every time you instructed me to adjust the records, I kept copies of everything. Mitchell shot up. This meeting is over. No, Sarah said, her voice steady. It's just beginning. You offered to resolve this. Here's how that happens. Judge Harrison steps down. All discriminatory fines from the past 5 years are reviewed and adjusted, and the court implements blind sentencing procedures to prevent this from happening again. Or, Baldwin challenged. Marcus smiled. Or this goes to the Judicial Conduct Board with our full evidence package. The FBI's Civil Rights Division has already expressed interest, and the media outside? They'd love to hear Miss Wells's story. Harrison slumped in his chair, suddenly looking old. You don't understand. The system, it's bigger than me. These traditions, these expectations. I understand perfectly, Sarah replied. You had power, and you abused it. You hurt families like mine because you could, because nobody stopped you. She took a deep breath. Until now. The silence stretched. Through the window, they could hear the growing crowd outside, reporters and community members gathering. Finally, Harrison reached for a pen with a trembling hand. What do you want me to sign? 2 hours later, Sarah emerged from the courthouse into bright sunlight. Behind her, Marcus handled the press conference announcing Harrison's resignation and the comprehensive review of his cases. Elena hugged her clerk friends who'd finally spoken up. Officer Chen nodded respectfully as she passed. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Jenkins. Maya's inhaler prescription is filled. We're all waiting at your house. Time to celebrate, child. Sarah looked back at the courthouse one last time. The steps where she once felt so small now seemed less imposing. Change, she realized, didn't always roar. Sometimes it started with a whisper, a trembling voice finding its strength to say, enough. The new plaque on the courthouse wall caught the morning sun. Equal justice under law. Richardson County Court Reform Act of 2024. Sarah paused to read it, adjusting her blazer, no longer her only good one, thanks to her recent promotion at the hospital. Ready for your speech? Marcus Rodriguez appeared beside her, now serving as the county's first civil rights compliance officer. The position had been created as part of the reforms following Harrison's resignation. As ready as I'll ever be, Sarah replied, watching the crowd gather in the courthouse plaza. Community members, legal professionals, and families, many of whom she now knew by name, filled the rows of chairs. Maya sat in the front row, her breathing clear and strong, holding up a handmade sign. My mom changed history. Beside her, Mrs. Jenkins beamed proudly, surrounded by her church ladies who'd become Sarah's extended family during the fight. Lisa Chen, now heading the court's new Digital Accountability Division, hurried over with fresh data on her tablet. First year's numbers are in. Racial disparity in fines dropped by 92%. Gender bias essentially eliminated. The blind sentencing protocol is working. Elena Martinez, recently promoted to chief court reporter, joined them. The new judge starts next week. First black woman on the bench in county history. She smiled. And guess what? She specifically requested all the documentation from your case. Wants to use it in her bias training seminars. Sarah climbed the steps to the podium, remembering how different it felt a year ago. The microphone picked up her voice clearly as she addressed the crowd. A year ago, I stood in this courthouse feeling powerless, she began. I was a single mother facing an impossible choice between paying an unjust fine and buying my daughter's medicine. But I wasn't alone. I just didn't know it yet. She gestured to the people around her. Officer Chen, who slipped me a business card. Mrs. Jenkins, who reminded me that justice was worth fighting for. Elena, who kept meticulous records. Lisa, who found patterns in the chaos. Marcus, who taught me that the law could be a shield for the righteous, not just a weapon for the powerful. In the audience, Amanda Wells, Harrison's former clerk, nodded. She'd found a new position in the reformed court system, this time with protections for whistleblowers built into her contract. The Richardson County Court Reform Act isn't just about preventing bias, Sarah continued. It's about creating accountability. Every fine is now reviewed by an independent panel. All sentencing data is public and transparent. We've established a community oversight board that reflects our county's true diversity. She pulled out a piece of paper from her pocket, Harrison's original $800 fine. This piece of paper changed my life, but not in the way Judge Harrison intended. It taught me that justice isn't just a word on a wall. It's a choice we make every day. To speak up, to stand together, to demand better. The crowd erupted in applause as Sarah concluded her speech. As she stepped down, Maya ran up to hug her, followed by Marcus Jr. Their future felt different now, more secure, more just. Later that evening, at the small celebration in their backyard, Sarah watched her children playing with their friends. Her phone buzzed with a message from a mother in Georgia, asking for advice about a similar situation in her courthouse. Sarah smiled, already drafting her response. The fight for justice wasn't over. It never really would be. But now there was a path forward, marked by the footsteps of those who refused to accept inequality as inevitable. Mom, Maya called out. Tell them the story again. Tell them how you changed everything. Sarah looked around at her gathered family, both blood and chosen, and began. It started with a choice between staying silent and speaking up. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of promise, as somewhere in the distance, another voice was finding the courage to say, enough.